Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this webinar co-produced by Emerging Minds and MHPN. My name's Chris Dolman, and I'm delighted to be joining you this evening for this webinar around the theme of using an intergenerational lens when working with children and parents. I'm filling in for Jill Munro, who couldn't join us as facilitator this evening, and it's my good fortune because I'm really looking forward to tonight's topic and the themes that our panel will be speaking to. So thanks so much for putting some time aside to join us this evening. As we begin, Emerging Minds and MHPN would wish to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia upon which our webinar presenters and you, the participants, are located. We wish to pay respects to elders past, present and future for the memories, the traditions, the culture and the hopes of Indigenous Australia. This webinar is the second in our fourth series around infant and child mental health between Emerging Minds and MHPN. We've got some other webinars coming up which might interest you, so I'm just going to flag those for you right now. In November we have one around cultural considerations in the social and emotional wellbeing support provided to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children and families. As well as in the new calendar year, we'll be looking at working with parents of infants and toddlers, strategies for case formulation with children, and also a further theme around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So yeah, lots ahead to be engaging with. And of course, if you'd like to receive more information about these, please subscribe to the Emerging Minds e-news. The details are there on the screen. You've already received the learning outcomes and also the case study regarding Hayley and Lewis and Crystal. So I don't think we'll go through those now, really just in the interests of time. But yeah, there's certainly some rich themes that are ahead for us this evening. Okay, so it's my pleasure now to introduce our panellists, and David Tully and Danielle Abbott. And so yeah, welcome to all of you. And yeah, I'd just love to sort of ask you an initial question to get the ball rolling for each of you. So, and I was wondering for you as an Emerging Minds child and family partner, like what is it that has had you sort of contributing to Emerging Minds and other organisations, you know, putting your time and bringing your lived experience knowledge to things like webinars and other things? How come that's been an interest of yours? How come that's been important for you?
I've seen that peer support and knowledge can help other families. Sharing my adversities and what has been helpful and unhelpful for me. People want to hear real life stories. They want to hear what's really happened to people and what really works and what's a true story. And they can relate to those and compare them to their own lives. And they can learn that there is some resilience in families, even in the face of adversities, that there is resilience in families. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Anne. Yeah, we really look forward to your contribution to our discussion this evening. Thanks very much for that. And yeah, David, in terms of your practice context at Relationships Australia SA, what do you think kind of using a intergenerational lens offers the practitioners and the families they work with?
I think the vital part of thinking about an intergenerational lens is that's the reality of that person's context, the beliefs, the stories, you know, the effects that they have, and both in terms of the way they've responded and had to manage some of those intergenerational effects as well. But often if we're asking people to think about making shifts and change, if we don't understand that context, often we can be quite unfair to people in terms of not understanding, you know, what those challenges are.
Mm-hmm. Great. Oh, thanks, David. Yeah, look forward to sort of exploring further how, I guess, that fairness you're describing can flow through our practice in our work with families. So thanks for that. Yeah, and Danielle, for you, you've worked with many families with experience across generations in terms of adversities and yeah, tough times. Like, what is it that kind of has sustained you in that work? What is it that kind of continues to draw you to it and sustain you in it?
Sure. So I work with the Australian Centre for Social Innovation, and what really drives me is finding like new ways to work with families. And I think it's important to define how I would define innovation. It's not saying necessarily just new, but better, easier, more attractive for families to get involved in. So all the programs that I work on draw on lived experience and peer responses, including Family by Family, Weavers, the Virtual Village. And what really drives me is not just seeing families having a better experience of a system, but actually seeing systems change the way they work, because of course they are systems who have been part of an intergenerational process themselves, responding and meeting the trauma of families. So seeing those shifts really drive me.
Yeah, great. Oh, thank you. Yeah, look forward to you bringing that lens to our discussion this evening as well. So thanks for joining us as well. Okay, so the structure for this evening is that we'll hear from each of our panellists and then move into a question and answer time. So please, as you're hearing our panellists speak, submit those questions. We'd love to be able to respond to those. And so to begin, and we'd like to start with you. If you could begin our series of presentations. Thank you.
When I was a child, my childhood was very emotional and physical and sexual abuse. And when I was a child, no one explained to me what was going on. I had no idea that we were even undergoing domestic violence. I had no idea. I didn't tell anybody for years and years, and still haven't told some people what I went through as a child. Even when I saw a counsellor, I didn't reveal any information. The fact that I didn't reveal it to anybody and was told to keep it a secret meant that it resulted in behaviours were seen as naughty and misbehaving and doing things to gain attention, and caused great concern for me because I felt very alone and unsupported. And not until after a very traumatic event was I able to feel free to share my experiences. I had a broken jaw once as a result of domestic violence, and I found that the doctor did nothing. So I didn't have any sort of confidence that anybody would help me. So I really kept it to myself. As a parent experiencing a mental illness, when I was unwell, practitioners took notice of me, but not me as a parent, or my children and their well-being. They didn't seem to realise that I'd had a life before my mental illness and that I was capable of doing things that perhaps they weren't aware of. When I went into an inpatient program away from home, there was no support from my partner and family and children. I have 5 children, and they felt very unsupported. They just felt that nobody cared about them and that all the light was on me. As a parent, trying to support my child's mental health was extremely hard. When my child was unwell and I took them to an emergency department, the way that we were received and treated brought up how I was responded to as a child, trying to make sense of the adversities in my family. My child and I were traumatised by the lack of understanding shown towards us. We were told that she was a naughty girl and she was shackled into her bed, and we were told that she wouldn't be getting any treatment. And that not only traumatised her, but traumatised me. And I was so traumatised that I didn't even respond to those responses from the medical staff. Me and my adult children wanting the best for the next generation, our experiences formed our hopes and dreams for the next generation. We have learned about trauma is that with treatment and understanding, things can change. That families are extremely resilient, and with the right care and the right attention, they can live a normal life. Slide 2. What my family found helpful really came from the outside of the home. Families First, as they were called then, which was part of human services. a social worker who helped both parents with the mental illness as well as the rest of the family. The social worker came into the home. They saw exactly what was happening in the family and could offer really meaningful supports, as well as they assisted towards a diagnosis of me. They helped us to do normal family things that others take for granted that get forgotten in trauma. I was encouraged to have some respite for myself and my children. So I had a few hours a week where I was separated from my children and they had time to themselves. And I found that my daughter has accessed childcare as well. She's finding it very useful and very helpful. What was very unhelpful was the child becomes a victim also when they're addressing domestic violence. The practitioners need to recognise that it has an extreme effect on parenting and on the children's mental health, as well as the individual presenting at the service. I raised my brother because of my parents' dysfunctional behaviours, so I burnt out very quickly as a parent myself. This led to my eldest daughter taking on a parenting role with her siblings, which has impacted on her family life and her adult life and the other children as well. What else was helpful? When I was unwell, slide 3. What else was helpful? Well, when I was unwell, talking to my partner and children in age-appropriate ways for what was happening for me and what was happening for them was really helpful. My children have now reflected that they have different memories and perspectives from what was happening, which meant that they weren't really addressed to the degree that I would have liked them to have been addressed. As I said before, families are resilient as long as they listen to. They need to be supported to be a family. They have the capacity to recover given the right support and the right people coming into the home or people that they go out and see. I've had a supportive partner, so that has helped me. My daughter, who had suffered domestic violence, hasn't had that support, and that has impacted on her mental health quite a bit. Slide 4. Practical and therapeutic supports that might help Hayley, Crystal and Lewis. For Lewis, support groups around addiction. He has an addiction to cannabis, and I found just for myself that when I had addictions that support groups were extremely helpful, meeting with other people and finding out that you were not the only one that was going through that, and making friendships around the support group. I also found a social group around domestic violence that acknowledges what you've gone through can be very helpful. Talking to other parents that are either undergoing domestic violence or have undergone domestic violence acknowledges what you've gone through and gives you some perspective into your life as you are living it. Relationship counselling is helpful as well. Time to talk away from the children, the parents, couple counselling. I know my husband and I found that extremely helpful, and I'm sure that Hayley and Lewis would find that helpful to be able to be away from their child and to discuss parenting issues and how they would like to parent their children and how they hope to see their children raised. Also financial counselling. a lot of people that develop PTSD and trauma quite often have to give up work, and in Hayley and Lewis's case, she was working 3 jobs, and some financial counselling might have been helpful for her to explain to her how she could manage her money and maybe not have to work as many jobs as she was doing. Respite for her and her children, a few hours a week using family daycare would have been very helpful. Trauma and domestic violence affect more than one generation. Parenting skills are affected, and this affects the children, but with help and resort and support, resilience and family support can be achieved. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Anne. Thanks for making sure that the reality of people's experience isn't kind of pushed to the side in our discussion this evening, and for reminding us of a number of things. The importance of that practical help and people being alert to children's experience, and also when you spoke about the hopes and dreams, I think there was the phrase you used for your children and grandchildren that really stood out to me as something that is certainly worthy of our attention when working with families, isn't it? So yeah, thanks so much for those reflections. David, on to you now to bring your perspective to this discussion. Thanks.
Yeah, and thanks, because that's, I think, a really good grounding in the realities of what it means to sort of managing the effects of intergenerational family issues and trauma, but also what it means to actually seek help and get engaged. So what I really want to focus on is what can we do, particularly thinking more of as a service provider, what can we do to sort of make that process as less feelings, a sense of stigma and shame, because within the intergenerational stories we hear around domestic violence, child sexual assault, a whole range of things. There's a whole range of tactics. Perpetrators have had people feeling a sense of shame. And then there's also a sense of shame as I'm struggling as a parent as well, and how are service providers going to be able to hear all those experiences and a sense of integrity as a person, not feeling that that stigma is going to make it even worse for people. So I just want to really talk a little bit about what we could do to sort of position to hear that stuff, so people feel able to engage services and get the help they need, the support they need to really understand those impacts of intergenerational sort of issues, but at the same time, a hope and a sense of things can be different as well. So, in terms of the first thing, I'd like to talk about a bit about what I call ethics in the face of adversity. What has it taken to hold on to some hopes and sense of what they want as an individual, in the scenario we have, it's Hayley as a mother, and what does she want for Crystal and her child, and what does she want her relationship in the context of all those quite negative historical influences, her mother experiencing violence, what she had to put up with the kid as well, and how do these ethics can actually be motivating factors for her as well, and noticing, because there's all stories about, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree and things like that. And some of those stories can make people, will I just end up endlessly repeat these sort of patterns? So we need to acknowledge those real, that real impacts and effects of that context, but also that people respond to that context in terms of, how they want to be different from those contexts as well. We've just moved through. So really, a start of that is also looking at that context of what, in this context, what Hayley's been up against, and also that really important issue about the way that the systems didn't support her in the past. And that's an important thing in terms of understanding intergenerational trauma. It's not just the trauma that occurred within families, but the trauma of not receiving help or not receiving acknowledgement, or systems just denying some of these issues occurred. There's a whole sense of trust and safety in dealing with systems that should offer support as well. So what I'd ask and be interested in, considering everything she's been up against in terms of, the experience of abuse as a child and current struggles in relationship, and then, doing 3 jobs and dealing with a 3-year-old child, considering all that, and I'd be also interested about what's going on in Lewis, because there's arguments and there's shouting. So I'd be interested in just obviously checking out her own sense of safety within that as well. But considering all that, what things has she done for her children? But also important within this case study, she also provides a lot of support to her siblings as well. So what amazing things has she done to create safety, a nurturing environment, stability and healing from trauma, even when she's been up against all those sort of things? So, because I think that's a good place to start a conversation, because then we can move to some of those negative impacts and effects that she's experiencing because of experience of trauma. But also we acknowledge she's not a failure as a parent. She's not a failure as a sibling, and she's done really amazing things to create, as I said, safety, nurturing, stability, and healing for trauma. Within that context as well. So how do we position to sort of hear differently? Because one of the really presenting issues when I looked at the case study is, she's feeling really quite angry about what's going on in her life in terms of her mother's experience of violence, what's going on for her siblings, that she'd hope her partner would have a much more active role in that relationship and support her parenting as well. So rather than just dismissing that anger, I'd really be interested in what that anger is about. What does anger stand for life? What is she wanting? Because I really have a sense that she's really wanting a life where, violence and abuse is not going to be a big part of Crystal's life, and the amazing thing she's doing to try make that. So she's out seeking help. That's quite amazing, because she hasn't had experience of really systems being really supportive for her as well, And a question we can ask, what would have meant if she wasn't angry, So really tuning into some of those ethics that sit behind that anger as well, which allows a conversation about how she wants that anger to look in her family. But until we sort of acknowledge there's some really legitimate things to be angry about, she may just even feel a sense of guilty about feeling angry and disappointed about what's going on as well. So, some of the things we might start to think about is what we call responses. Considering everything she's been up against, how she responded and resisted some of those negative historical influences. So some of the things we just call is understanding what we call that social response. Because it's important when we understand trauma, there's clearly the impacts of the actual traumatic events themselves, but also the lack of positive social responses can itself be traumatic. And when particularly you're struggling as a parent with all those negative historical influences, it can be very hard to feel like you're acknowledged. So just knowing who knows what you're up against, considering that, what did it take to get through? What's it taken to hold on to those values of wanting something very different for Crystal, And where does she want those values to take her and Crystal and a child too, and her relationships too as well? So, that anger can also be a really motivating force to think about what she wants different in her life as well. So I said, and just to, briefly cover this, and I think it's an important way we can think around trauma, and I think, many different perspectives on trauma are really valid, but there's one also, rather than asking people just about how are they impacted by that trauma, and that's important to have space to acknowledge that as well, but asking questions about how do people respond. So considering that, what you're up against, you told me this amazing thing, how you looked after your siblings. What did that take? How did you work out the best way to look after your siblings? Even though we would hope that children don't have to take that role, they've had to take on that role. So not just how they've impacted, but also how they responded is really important as well. So when people abuse, they do many things to oppose the abuse and keep their dignity and self-respect, and this is called resistance. Clearly, resistance just means you're able to stop the abuse, because that's obviously not understanding some of those power dynamics around domestic violence, but people do things to try to protect themselves, hold on to their dignity, try to create what they can around nurture and stability, and some of those, processes around healing from trauma by building, relationships in the context of that pattern of violence and abuse as well. So I think that's a good place then to think about, once we have some of those conversations started and there's not so much a sense of fear of judgment coming from us as practitioners, to pivot to the children. And really so we can get to a sort of a shared understanding of that family's circumstances and what do people worry about, and, you know, is she worried about the arguments, how they're impacting on Crystal and how she's making, and coming up with some different ideas and strategies. But we really want to avoid those sort of shaming responses, because that role and identity for her as a parent and wanting Crystal to have a life different than what she had as a child is a really important space. So we don't want to, either explicitly or inadvertently create a shaming response as well. And we know when parents are feeling worried about a lot of issues, it's really hard for them to sort of have space to hold their child in mind, as we call it, as well. So it's acknowledging all those other things which make it hard. But we'll talk about with the arguments about, is it an adult-centred way of dealing with the stuff when her and Lewis argue, or can come up with some more child-centred responses that acknowledge what it means, for Crystal to be hearing this, and is this just what she wanted, and this is what she was hoping, because that's about, by understanding all those things she feels overwhelmed about, so she can hold a little more space to be able to hold Crystal in mind as well. And just as the final comments, and this is a whole discussion that's worthy of whole presentation, but how do we widen out that circle? Because when people are experiencing context they're finding challenging, there's and that's that, what we call that social response. What would it mean to reach out to a partner, Lewis, and have him thinking about what his hopes for a family and what some of the behaviours he could be doing to be more the dad that he hopes to be as well. Also her mum. Her mum's been through, many, many different experiences over the years of domestic violence and other abuse, and, who could offer her support as well. But also that idea of who else could we connect you into, wider family, friends, community, other connections as well. Because we can sometimes, it's important to value some of the work we can do therapeutically or in groups as well, but the people's identity is much more wider. So how can we widen that circle out as well to offer support around healing from this whole intergenerational, effects of abuse as well?
Great, thanks, David. Thanks so much for. There's so much in each slide really that you've spoken about. I guess. I was really interested in your conversations. You're talking around, Hayley's ethics and the effort she's made to protect Crystal or her brothers. To provide that safety. And how that can provide a foundation for pivoting to the children, and in ways where conversations about children can be had that perhaps aren't so shaming or blaming of her. So thank you for those reflections. And Danielle, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anne and David. When I read Hayley's story, I was really curious about the intergenerational kind of aspect of this and how we could help Hayley come on that journey. And one of the tools that we often use when we're working with families is what we call a journey map, or when we're working with them, we might call it their family signature. And we acknowledge that every family has ups and downs, and that everybody has their unique family signature. So here's an example of a family signature that has come from a family. And I'd be really wanting Hayley to maybe reflect back on her childhood, on her experiences of being parented herself when she was a child, and to maybe start mapping out some of the ups and downs that she remembers, the moments that she felt scared, or the moments that she felt were really positive in her family, and how could we map out those ups and downs. But I think that actually Hayley probably has a whole pile of strategies that she hasn't seen in herself either. And so really using her story to actually hear what they are. Already in what I read, I was able to see so many strengths in her. She's employable, caring, empathetic. She's a committed parent. And she has a real awareness that she wants things to change, which I think is really important on the process of working with somebody, is that they're at a place where they're contemplating that they want something to be different. But there's also a lot in Hayley's life that she has not chosen for herself. She didn't choose to be in a caring role when she was a teenager. She hasn't chosen the job that she's in. She hasn't chosen the friends that Lewis is hanging out with at the moment or the impact that that's having on her family. And she hasn't chosen to be living with or having experienced domestic violence. So although I'm wanting Hayley to think back around her own experiences, I don't want her to get stuck in actually feeling overwhelmed by her story too. So what I would be wanting to do is for her to choose one of the low points on that story and one of the high points on that story, and tell me what were the things that she had to say, think, feel and do to get from a low point to a high point. And I find that families have often not actually gone, oh, I was doing a whole pile of things there. I had to think that I'm worthy of this. I had to say, I'm going to get out of bed today. You know, I'm actually going to put a job application in. They have a whole pile of strategies that they have not named as strategies that can really be drawn out through like the storytelling and journey mapping experience. So I guess that would be my starting point with Hayley. I might go to the next slide. But then we're bringing Hayley into the now. What's happening for her now? What's actionable? And, you know, really bearing in mind that Hayley has had a lot of things that she felt she hasn't chosen. I'd be really wanting to give her a lot more agency and choice. And so goal setting is one of the ways that I would do that. And I think it's really important when we're working with the family that actually they're given the choice of the goal that they want to set or work on right now. A lot of families have told me that they often try to make a change because a service or a social worker or somebody has told them that if they don't, they might lose their kids, or they're making the change because they're feeling pressured to make a change. But what does it actually mean for this to be a real change for Hayley, and what are the choices we can give to Hayley in that? I want her to choose something that is going to be meaningful to her. So when we're setting a goal, I'd be asking her for one goal, and that could be a small goal at first because these can change over time. So sometimes the kinds of goals that you hear from families who are actually living with quite a lot of chaos and stress and toxic stress in their life are as simple as, I'd really love to be able to take my kids to the park. I haven't done that in a long time. And starting where Hayley is starting from. Sorry, I just lost the screen and it came back to me there. Yeah, but also what is it going to take to make that goal, and naming those actions, like helping Hayley see that, you know, what are 3 things that you can do that's going to help you get you and your kids to the park. Let's actually name what it's going to take. But most importantly, what I would be wanting to explore with Hayley is, if you make these changes, what are going to be the outcomes for you? What are you going to be feeling? What's going to be different? So the kinds of things we hear when we're setting outcomes like this are, I'm going to feel more confident, I'm going to feel happier, I'm going to feel less stressed. This is really important, I think, because it's going to help her, you know, see that there are pros that are going to be meaningful in her life to help her reach this goal. I also just want Hayley to feel like she's in control, she's in the driver's seat. At no point do I want to feel like I'm a worker in Hayley's life and she isn't directing this change meaningfully for herself and her family. I might go to the next slide. Yeah, so thinking forward, and this is, I guess, the real intergenerational part of it, is what does Hayley want Crystal to be like as a parent? And as we're building on those goals and like increasing like her kind of sense of confidence in getting there, what is it we're going to shift now when Crystal does her own journey, her own ups and downs? What are going to be part of her story, and how's that going to affect her children? But as I said earlier, I'm really, really interested in the relationships that we can broker to families that are not professional relationships, that are peer support, that are lived in experience. I think Anne said earlier very strongly that people want to hear a real story. Well, that is true for professionals. Like, we love hearing what the experience of interacting with the system is like for families. but there's more true for families in my experience. And families tell me that when they meet somebody else who's been there, done that, got the T-shirt, that there's no judgment in that moment in the same way as it might be when you're sitting with a professional. So I'll be really wanting to build out Crystal and Hayley's community, broker them to like long-term sustainable relationships that are real human relationships that can sustain beyond an intervention that might happen for a family. I'll just comment quickly that it might seem that Lewis has kind of been missing from my story in this journey. And for me, when I was looking at the case study, the reason that was when I was thinking about the stages of change that people are at and when people are ready to actually make a change. And for me, it really felt like Hayley was like going, I want something to be different here. And she was ready to go on a journey to change that trajectory. I had the feeling that Lewis, and it is an assumption, so I should be going and talking to Lewis about where he is, but it felt like that maybe he hadn't come to that same conclusion just yet. But my experience with families is that a family works as a system, and when you change one part of that system, you start to see shifts in the system. So my starting point would be to work with Hayley, who is showing a lot of readiness now, and my belief is that at a point in time, Lewis would enter into the relationship that we're having as a family. Thank you.
Great, thanks Danielle. Yeah, again, really appreciated this thinking about Crystal as a parent and the kind of conversations that might and possibilities, I guess, that might generate for Hayley as well, both in terms of how she is towards Crystal as well as the things you've spoken about in terms of community and connection as well. So, yeah, thanks so much for bringing that lens to our discussion. Thank you to everyone who's been submitting questions. We've had a stack coming through, and that's really really interesting questions. And so thank you. Please continue to submit those. Actually, Danielle, there's one that's just come through from someone, Paul, which is on the theme you're just talking about. So I might go to that. It's a big question, but Paul mentions one of the key aspects of DV mental health or illness is the isolation factor. You know, this is one of the missing ingredients that are often missed or ignored. How do we change this? How do we kind of counter isolation? And I'm just wondering if there's some learnings or something that might have come from your work around countering isolation that families
Absolutely.
face. Yeah.
So that is the core of the work that we do. So Family by Family is a network of families who are helping other families to make change in their life. What we do in Family by Family is we take families who've been through a tough time, but they've come out the other side and they're doing really well now. They're having more ups than they are downs, and they're far enough away from their story. So we would talk about it as, is it an open wound or is it a scar? They're far enough away from that story. It's a scar that they feel like they could help somebody else. And we connect them to families who are right in the thick of that tough time. So instead of coming into contact with a professional or a service, they can come into contact with a friend and somebody who can walk alongside them at times to access the services that they need without having to do that alone. So it doesn't discount the need for professional intervention, but it says actually it's really hard sometimes, and it's even harder when you're isolated. And the families that we work with, it doesn't matter what they're experiencing, whether it's drug and alcohol misuse, family and domestic violence, neglect, the one thing that they all have in common, as what I see as the biggest risk factor, is that they are socially isolated. So if we can actively help to grow that social capital around a family, we're helping to affect all the social determinants of health that sit around that family as well.
And I'm wondering too, when you work with families, that you might hear accounts of them, beginning to kind of reach out or counter the isolation themselves. And I guess, that can open up different possibilities as well. Would that be right from what you're saying, or different to what? Yeah.
Absolutely. And I think that often the goal that a family will set was to be less lonely, or they might not know how to. A lot of the families we work with, they want to take their kids to the park, they want to engage with other families, but they have this sense of like, what if people are looking at me and judging me? And that might not be a narrative that is a true narrative, but it's sitting there and it's something stopping them from engaging. But if we can broker them to a trusting relationship that can help role model that and in context go with them, we can start to break down some of those kind of fears that are sitting there for families.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for that. And there's been a number of questions that have come in for you and people really wanting to acknowledge your contribution to the discussion. So I just sort of mention that. And there was a question around what helps when a child's trauma is like triggering their parents' childhood responses. So I guess like what helps parents in those circumstances where they're, I guess, being where their child, the trauma their child's facing is reminding them of their own experiences. Have you got some thoughts about that? Yes, that's
extremely hard. It's, I found that learning healthy ways to cope, it sounds corny, but mindfulness and meditation. I used to dissociate when the children triggered me with their yelling and their screaming, and it took me back to my childhood, and I would dissociate, and I found that was a really unhealthy way to manage it. I mean, it worked wonderfully, but it wasn't healthy. So I started to do learning mindfulness and meditation so that when those times happened, I was more serene and more quiet and didn't snap back and argue back, which was would have been the other alternative to blocking it out completely and just not relating to it at all, which is completely unhealthy.
Right, yeah, thank you for that. There's also, I'm just staying with you, there's a question from Heidi in reference to your children having different understandings of what happened or, what was going on for them at the time. And so, drawing on that experience, what you would say around, do you think if others had provided broader explanations to the children when they were young, this would have been more helpful? Is that something, to keep children more in the picture, more informed? Is that something you would kind of advocate for or that your experience would tell you?
Oh, yes, definitely. I feel that my children were forgotten. The focus was on mum who had a mental illness and not the children who were also victims as well, because they were being traumatised to some degree. And my children have said to me that that they remember certain things that actually didn't happen or happened in a different way, and had they been explained by health professionals what was happening, they would have had a more realistic understanding of what happened. Because now I have difficulty when I say to them, or they say to me, a certain occurrence happened, and I say, well, it wasn't like that, but that's their reality because they weren't explained properly what was happening. And of course, children kind of make up their own stories and their own realities, and their realities are their realities. And now I have to accept that, even though I do try and explain that things weren't quite the same as they remembered it, and had they had more education around it, they might have seen things slightly differently.
Right. Yeah. No, thank you for that response. David, there's some questions for you as well. Someone's asked a bit about how best can we present this intergenerational lens in discussion with a client who's sitting in crisis, has a history of frequent and significant self-harm and suicide actions, to present concern and consideration for their children, which doesn't come across as dismissive of them. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, you might have begun to speak about that, but Is there more you'd like to say about that?
Yeah, and I think part of this is whatever the context when you engage in someone, but particularly when there's a lot of crisis going on, when they're really struggling with that sense of, feeling that they need to harm themselves or, really struggling with a sense of hope and connection to sort of life. It's really important that we set the proper groundwork to have some of those sort of conversations. And it can be actually vital for people to join the dots between what I'm experiencing now, the experiences around, trauma or abuse or violence or racism or, being put in, what were euphemistically called children's homes. They were almost like prison camps for children. It's important that we can help them join those sort of dots in a way but also to know that in a way that's not overwhelming for them as well, and that considering that they really were able to respond, the best they could now. And part of that is understanding from that developmental context we were just talking about before, that children will respond the best way they can based on a level of, cognitive, emotional ability to make sense and meaning of what they're going through as well. So I think it's important we can help join the dots so people just don't think, is there something just completely wrong with me? As opposed to, well, no, these things can be impacts and effects of violence and abuse. I remember at exercise somebody, a colleague of mine showed me where he would get people to sort of, a certain stage of therapy, a little bit more into it, talk about some of those trauma and then sort of list on a whiteboard what they thought some of the effects were. And then he'd ask them to go back, and if we sort of rubbed out the trauma or the abuse or the violence, which of these effects we might have had? They say, like, yeah, maybe I still would have been a quite anxious person. But yeah, I don't think I would have been struggling so much with the intensity of feelings of self-harm and suicidality as well. So I think it's helping people join that sort of dots up, but it's got to be manageable for them. Because if they're in their complete crisis, you just got to help them, get some stability and find some sort of point of stability in their life. But it's vital for them to help join those dots up as well. And it's really critical, particularly because, that intergenerational trauma that's not acknowledged. And if we don't acknowledge it, people then can't have that conversation to help them connect up those dots.
Great, thanks. Thank you, David. A question for Danielle in relation to your work with families and communities. Danny, what sort of further considerations are there for working with Aboriginal families? In addition to some of the things we've talked about already, I guess, or alongside of some of the things we've talked about already.
Yeah. So I think that there's actually a number of things that we should be considering. And a few years back, we did a co-design project because we realised that in the programs we were delivering, we were really missing the mark as far as actually engaging Aboriginal community and Aboriginal families. So in order to try and unearth or understand what it was that we weren't quite getting right, we went out and we spoke with families who were interfacing with different services. We spent time with them. We did what we called ethnographic practices, where we actually walked in the shoes of families. We lived life as families lived it, and we tried to watch what were the ups and downs of a day, what was the experience of interacting with services like. But we also talked with Aboriginal workers who were working in the sector. And a few things came out that I actually think are really significant. Firstly was this little shift in our thinking around, I guess, what it meant to be culturally adaptive opposed to operating in a way that felt like culturally appropriate. So families and workers told us that they saw that non-Aboriginal people were often frozen by this idea of what if we get it wrong? What if we're culturally inappropriate? But of course, families were saying, well, culture means something different to us all, and we're actually really diverse, and we're sick of being lumped into one group as the Aboriginal families. So we started talking with families about this idea of being culturally adaptive when we worked with them, and what did it mean to actually respond to the person who was sitting in front of you rather than necessarily the culture. And I really remember one quote that really stands out to me from a worker who was talking about the fact that, you know, she was tired of always making spaces culturally safe for white people. But she said that what she sees as the biggest kind of barrier is that non-Aboriginal people are often too scared to start. And so she was saying to us, you know, be upfront, make mistakes, don't think you know everything, be honest. That's what showing respect is. And yeah, that just really stuck with me throughout that. But also, like, I would be really mindful of past policy that actually caused, as David touched on, intergenerational trauma in its own regards. And so the language I'm using, I'm really aware of. For instance, and I've used it tonight, the language of intervention. What does that mean in my context? So what does that mean in a family's context? How much paperwork are we using over valuing relationship at the beginning of an interaction? And can we move that aside to value the relationship? So all of those things would be, coming up for me.
Yes, great. Thanks, Danielle. Lots of rich descriptions there of what you've provided. So thank you for those. I'm just looking over some other questions as well, and there's been some others for you in relation to like accessing services along with your children, together with your children. So like when working with children and parents, like for you, or based on your experience, you know, would you recommend or advocate for kind of joint sessions or separate sessions or a combination of both? Obviously, practitioners are sort of wondering about how to structure their work with families. Like, what are your reflections around that, Anne?
Well, I've had experience of both, where I just had joint sessions, or I just had individual sessions, and my family didn't have family sessions, and I didn't find that very effective. With my daughter, who went through domestic violence as well, when she had sessions, she had individual sessions, and that gave her a chance to debrief and explain and get some help. And then the family was brought in. My husband and I were brought in, and her the other siblings were invited to come in and work as well. And we found that worked really well because they were getting the whole story, not just one side of the story, but everybody. It was affecting everybody, so everybody had an opinion and everybody had an idea on how things should work. And it was really good having a family session where somebody was in watching and making comments on how we could do things better, things could be done better, but also individual therapy is important for the person with the domestic violence and the mental illness. So I think that's really important as well.
Great, thanks. And David, from a practitioner perspective, I guess this is a dilemma that you and your colleagues might face in your work. Do you have sort of other comments to make about how to navigate through that at all?
Yeah, I mean, just notice what Anne said, because I think there's quite a lot of wisdom there, really. I think part of it is obviously thinking about how you're going to sort of structure this work and what conversations are better that, people can have that space and privacy, whether a child or an adult, to explore and make meaning and sense of some of those experiences, to be in a place that they can, look at that co-gen work. But more and more I've become very interested in, it's almost in the experience of feeling that competence and connection of the parent in of itself can actually be healing from trauma. Like the actual experience, that sense of connection and competency, be able to hold that child in mind can in itself be quite healing for trauma. We know I sort of acknowledge some of the work, some of my colleagues do here. We have a program put together for kids, and they do these amazing, even with babies, is what they call infant massage sessions that's really helping parents attune to even a baby at that age when, you know, they're going through quite significant trauma, and programs they call the garden where they do outdoor-based activity stuff with quite young children and really get children, so parents be able to notice and delight in their child and provide some structure around that. So I think it's a combination of both, but equally, you know, that importance of that relational connection being honoured and supported. So as long as a parent doesn't feel like, you know, their capacity as parents being undermined in any of that sort of process, but also children also need some space about meaning and sense of what they've been going through, and sometimes, you know, that's hard to do around their parent as well, because, you know, I believe that, you know, children and you know, are trying to make meaning and sense of those sort of experiences the best way they can based on what that stage of development. So sometimes they need space to do that as well. But I think it's really being able to offer, you know, both, but really that focusing on developing ways we can do the work more joined up as well. So it's not completely separated. I think it's interesting for me as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, David. Yeah, just on that kind of practice focus, and thank you everyone for the many questions that are being submitted. It's very rich things to be thinking about. Danielle, do you have any kind of suggestions for questions, like open-ended questions, to encourage parents to consider their own intergenerational lens in the work that you do? You know, when discussing like their parenting approach, or are there ways you encourage, other ways you encourage that conversation? Or
what really comes to mind with this question is a program that we implemented during the first wave of COVID lockdowns here in South Australia, where the South Australian government were particularly concerned about women who are living in rural communities who were further isolated and may be exposed to domestic violence. So we created a virtual peer village called the Virtual Village, where we linked people up with lived experience. And one of the tools that was really helpful during that time that we drew on, which is an open sourced tool through narrative practice, was one called the Tree of Life. And like really using tools instead of questions in order to help elicit kind of information, I find really useful. So like in that situation, we were like, you know, maybe you could think about the roots, you know, being, you know, the basis of your parenting, you know, is the soil rich? Is it poor? Is it shallow? Is it deep? Is it, you know, you're really coming from a curious way around this, or the trunk might be the values you want to see present. The thorns might be some of the, you know, the tougher things that have happened, but they can also become the fruits, and helping people to talk about it in a more abstract way, what they're experiencing, we found really helpful, rather than having to necessarily talk about the trauma. So that's what that question really brought to my mind.
So you think this has some sort of learnings for, you know, post-COVID, or, you know, context as well in that sense, use of metaphor. And particularly what we found for women experiencing domestic violence in that context was that they didn't necessarily want somebody from their own community to be connected to. So it was very helpful to be able to use the internet to connect them to women all over the country who could be there with them, but not necessarily be somebody who knows their story, who's too close to home. Yeah. Thanks, Danielle. There's a question about working with migrant and refugee families. David, for you, like, how do you approach intergenerational work with migrant and refugee or called families, and engage them in these kind of conversations? Are there extra considerations that would be important to speak to?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to start with is, you know, it's easy to just put all people who are, you know, into this sort of bracket of being cold. So that's speaking to an amazing rich diversity of people with different experiences. We can make some assumptions. Someone's certain country, they all have the same experience and be all from the same religious sort of background. So we really be open to be able to, I think that cult really understand that context, which is, going to be really important as well. And we don't realise how many things we actually think about parenting, we picked up from our own cultural context. So we need to be able to reflect on, what do I believe about parenting? How did I pick up from my context, from my, white privileged background and things that I learnt to think as a sort of assumptions about the way parenting should have worked as well. But to look at that intergenerational lens, there's real diversity of why people, how they came to Australia with skilled pathways, or whether they came through had refugee experiences or still on an asylum seeking pathway as well, because obviously for asylum seekers, they're still not really even sure where to put down roots. So you've got people who are dealing with the experiences of trauma, violence, torture, war, a whole range of different sort of experiences, as well as maybe intergenerational trauma within their sort of family. And the one thing we know is that point of stability, so that they don't even necessarily have that, where are my connections going to be? The other thing to be important to be thinking about is the whole level of what's known as acculturation. What does it mean to go from one cultural context to be shifted to another one as well? And what does that do, particularly because we're focusing on parenting and intergenerational effects on your experience as parenting as well. So there's a whole bunch of energy and headspace, going on. We also need to think about experiences of racism and judgment and stigma as well, and assumptions about people's parenting practices being deficits as well. So we need to be really mindful of all those sort of issues. Mm. And the other important thing, and particularly focusing on refugee asylum seekers experience, when it's not just intergenerational, interfamily trauma, when you have whole countries that have been traumatised by war or colonisation as well, which obviously have echoes with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders communities within this sort of country as well. Like there's a whole society or community that's adapting to trauma as well. But I think we need to be open and be that curiosity, that respect, and as well as that, not being afraid to have those challenging conversations, because that's that really big feedback from COLD communities as well, as people either judge us and sort of tell us what to do, then run away, but are not willing to sit down and actually work with us to understand how we adapt those sort of practices as well to our current context as well.
Yeah, thanks, David. I think your comments also had me thinking about, when you spoke about Hayley's protective efforts as well, actually the protective efforts of whole communities to keep families safe or communities safe, or respond in some way to the trauma as the community that they've faced as well. Could well be important conversations, to be having. So, thank you. Thank you for those as well. Someone's also asked a bit about what does post-traumatic growth look like intergenerationally too. So I guess taking hold of this concept of post-traumatic growth and wondering about that through an intergenerational lens as well. Like if you were to sort of take hold of that concept, what would that have you each being interested in terms of what you'd be asking about or seeking to discover with the families you're working with? So, David or Danielle or Anne, if you'd like to respond to that.
I'll provide a quick response, Lang, and everybody else. I think it's a really important lens to be thinking about, and it sort of ties back to not only do people are affected and impacted, and it's vital we don't shut down the space to explore that, but they actively respond. The amount of families you work with and people who've experienced incredibly abusive and violent contexts, or been in children's homes where, children's prison camps basically, when there's been a horror, and they've managed to somehow hold on to that relationship connecting to even their own siblings and, other children and young people are in that sort of space and still have that story about being a protector and be able to hold on to that. So I think we just need to be open to those sort of stories around, the way people respond, and what that means in terms of that post-traumatic growth stuff as well.
Thanks, Tim.
I actually had a beautiful conversation just today with a family that this really came to mind for me, where She went from being a seeking family where she was seeking support through to helping others and doing that for many years, and then through the confidence of that went back to uni and has become a psychologist and a professional in her own right. And she just found out that her kids have now also enrolled and are going back to uni, which is something that she never thought was going to be possible for her and her family. And the quote that she said to me is, "I've broken the generational cycle." And it really stood out to me that she knew that her role in that and what it looked like for the next generation as well. And I think that we can have that hope for families, and that we should set the bar that high for the families that we're working with, rather than just thinking about what it means to get them through the tough time that they're in right now.
Thanks, Danielle. What about for you, Anne? What does that idea of post-traumatic growth kind of bring to mind for you?
Well, I was interested in David's comment about the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And I think that a lot of people think that that's automatically how a family is going to develop and function. I know that I, as a was told by a professional practically that same thing, that it was my fault that my daughter had suffered a mental illness, that monkey see, monkey do. And that was traumatic for me to hear that. And my family have developed into different ways, and a lot of them have gone into caring roles. So even though they were probably traumatised to some degree by my mental illness, and they developed some degrees of mental illness, they have managed to develop careers where they're in caring roles, like social work and looking after disabled children. So it shows that families can get through these rough times, that they are resilient, and that they can break through that apple hasn't fallen, far from the tree type of thing. That they, with help, that they can create happy families.
Thanks, Anne. Yeah, it's we're actually got to finish shortly. I just feel that's a really significant thing to sort of have said at this stage of the webinar as well. For each of you, is there something you'd like to sort of add at this point, just a final closing comment or message you'd like to be really clear about right now? Not to reduce our whole conversation to a minute's comment, but what's standing out to you? What would you like to pass on? Danielle, is something coming to mind for you?
I just want to really take the moment to say thank you to Anne as well, because it's been such a privilege to be on this panel with you, and thank you for the bravery of sharing your story. And I think my parting message would be to be in tune to those stories and to really listen to them, but not necessarily listening to them in the way of what are the problems, but really trying to understand. And one of the things I'm always trying to hear is what is holding those problems in place in our systems, and what is our role in it to change some of those processes. So that would be my parting kind of, call to action for anybody who's come here, is what is it that's being held in place? How are we playing a part in keeping the problems in place? In how can we change that in very small ways in what we do?
Thanks, Danielle. Yeah. And is there a final comment you'd like to make?
You're talking, sorry, was that
me? Yeah, and is there something else you'd like to say?
I'd just like to say that intergenerational, looking through the lens of intergenerational, that families, again, I have to say, are resilient, and with the right help and the right support, they can come out the other end and you can recover. Recovery is possible. It doesn't have to go on from generation to generation to generation. You can sort of put the block on there somewhere and stop it from going on from generation to generation. But it requires a lot of understanding and a lot of patience, I think.
Thank you, Anne. David, for you, is there something you'd like to mention right now at the end?
Yeah, I think just going with that the sort of that myth that the apple, the seed doesn't fall far from the apple tree. It's actually quite amazing how far some seeds do travel, and it's quite amazing how even under rocky ground or not a lot of water, that people, that those seeds can still grow and develop as well. And I think if we could understand and tune ourselves into that a lot more, there'll be a lot to learn, both in terms of the way we can sort of structure our communities and our social responses, but even the way we do counselling and the way we do our groups as well, because those stories are based on the realities of surviving and responding to really adverse circumstances. So seeds do travel far, I think would be my final word.
Thanks, David. Thank you to all three of you. Yeah, I've really appreciated bringing your perspectives, your insights, your reflections to our conversation this evening. So thanks, Anne, David and Danielle. And also thanks to all of the people that have participated, including those that have submitted questions, been involved in the chat room and been listening and viewing along. We do have some other resources and further reading that's available for you, which you can access via the resources icon. There's more information about these themes and children's mental health and wellbeing more broadly at the Emerging Minds website. You can see other upcoming webinars there as well, as I've already spoke about at the start of the webinar. We'd love to have you join us for those. So thank you everyone for your participation, and apologies to those whose questions we didn't get to, but they won't go to waste. We'll find other ways of seeking to respond to those, and so thank you for that. And also there is a feedback survey, as I mentioned from the start. It'd be great and greatly appreciated if you could take some time to fill that in. Thank you very much. There will be statements of attendance that are issued in the next month or so, and you'll also be sent a link to this webinar recording and the other resources in about a month or so's time as well. So yeah, I'd just like to finish by reiterating that this webinar was co-produced by MHPN and Emerging Minds for the National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health project. The National Workforce Centre for Child Mental Health is funded by the Australian Government Department of Health under the National Support for Child and Youth Mental Health program. So thanks also to everyone behind the scenes at Emerging Minds and also MHPN, and look forward to your company next time. If you'd like to continue this discussion, there are other opportunities through the MHPN local forums, and or if you'd like to establish one, MHPN project officers are available to work with you to do that. There's stacks of networks around the country. So check out the mhpn.org.au website for all of that. Thank you very much, folks, and hope you have a good evening. We'll see you next time. Thank you.